Welcome back to the Church Biz podcast. We're here today to have just a conversation around a topic that I think will be helpful to most churches that we serve. That's our hope with this podcast is that it would be a resource for you. And we're going to talk about ways to create a culture of generosity in your church. And this, the outline for this came from a blog post we did a couple years ago. And that blog post was inspired by something we both were a part of, leading in a local church. We'd hit a bit of a budget crunch, had a little bit of a crisis moment, and it made us really think about how are we cultivating generosity in our local church. And so we kind of came out with these points and wanted to share that. And so we got 5 points we're going to walk through, and we'll just kind of do this conversationally, very low key as we typically are. But Chris, I thought I would, I didn't introduce you yet, but I think you're just known, like people know who you are. Chris Mallonee, CPA, one of the partners of Church Biz. So there's the introduction. So,
hello.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
But I thought we could just talk through these points, and hopefully as you're listening, if you're at a church or even a nonprofit, not all of these apply to nonprofits, but if you're at a church, it can give you some ideas to how to cultivate generosity in your local church. By no means are we telling you what to do. We're just sharing what we did and some things, some principles that we think will be helpful. So really the number one, the first thing we did was tighten spending.
Yeah.
You know, all the finance people love that one. That's a good one. But we really, when we hit that budget crisis, it made us examine what are we using our money on? How are we spending? What are some of the things that maybe the projects or expenditures coming up that we could press pause on? And so that was one thing we did. We had our staff look through their budgets and say, hey, we're hitting a lean season. What are some of the things we can cut out? Obviously, we don't want to fire people or cut essential things, but that was one of the things we did. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, you touched on it exactly. It's challenging when you go through a season like that. One of the positives that come out of it is it causes you to evaluate where your dollars are going when you come into that, and not that we were being unwise or feel like we were being bad stewards prior to that, but when you know, like, okay, we're coming into a leaner season, a tighter season, that we've been experiencing, the word that I use is prioritize mission. And so you're thinking about, okay, when you're having to make decisions, you don't want to cut anything. And so in our context, we looked at, hey, are we still at the percentage of budget that's going to staffing that we want to be? Are we comfortable with our debt policy? Are we really funding the mission of the organization in the areas you can typically cut on, like you said, extra events, extra projects, if you can really get lean on your administrative stuff. So that's one, was the prioritization of mission in your spending. The second thing is planning for the future. We had a 3-month rainy day fund. We had 3 months of operational expenses in savings, and that allowed us to actually pivot without having to reduce staff, reduce any significant ministry programs, and then be able to readjust and align with the new giving numbers that we had for the rest of that year. So prioritization of mission, planning for a rainy day by having 3 to 6 months in savings are the two big things that help there.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to just highlight that for all the churches watching, that we do recommend that you have a reserve fund of 3 to 6 months, depending on, if you want to be overly conservative, or at least the minimum 3 months of what it takes to operate your church in that time period. And so that gave us the time to make some timely decisions, but not to rush and not to make any rash moves.
And the goal is, like you're saying, is if you have a high concentration of large donors and something happens to one or two of those donors, or just you're in a town where an industry gets hurt and there's a bunch of layoffs, we don't have to shut the doors of the church in a month because we didn't plan for this. And so through why we say 3 to 6 months is you're a nonprofit. People are giving for the mission of the church. So you don't want to sit on more than you need, but you want to have adequate reserves for times like that.
Yeah. One other thing that came out of that crisis was and we mentioned this, but it made us scrutinize some of the things we were spending money on too. Like we realized, hey, we don't need these subscriptions anymore. You
Yeah.
see those apps that'll get that for you, but
Hmm.
sometimes when things are good, you just kind of get a little lax on your budget and you're not looking as closely at the detail. And so as we dug into that, we found some savings on some subscriptions, some things that we were no longer using that we could cut out. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think too, on that note, last thing I'd say on this point, from my perspective, is we'd always had really good finance team leadership, and we always had a good plan. But when you have to start scrutinizing to that level, one thing that came out of that season 2 was when we had a finance charter in place, we had regular finance team meetings happening, but we also allowed us to revisit some policies and use a term that we talk about in our resourcing called benchmarking. And benchmarking is just evaluating what you're spending against a standard to make sure that you're in line. And so we actually went through and benchmarked how much cash do we want to have on hand? What's our debt to revenue ratio? How much do we want to spend on staffing, facilities, administration, outside giving, every category? And we put where we were at currently at the time, what our target was, and benchmark that against 3 experts and what they recommend that you spend in that area. So that was actually guiding principles for us as a finance team, as church leaders, to say, here's the target. And if we want to take out debt, if we want to go less than 3 months, we actually have to have a finance team approval within these benchmarks. And I'd quickly mention 3 sources we used was Cap and Krause, their audit and assurance firm. They also work in nonprofit tax. They have a church financial health index, so they help with these metrics I'm talking about. ECCU, which became Adelphi, is a church finance and lending institution, and they have stewardship services, Christian-based resourcing materials. And then Church Law and Tax is another group that's pretty well known in this space for helping set benchmarks. And guy Richard Hammer, who I think is great, does a lot of the work on that. So those were the 3 groups we used, their benchmarks, to compare where we were at, to make sure that we felt like our spending was in line and our finance team was comfortable with how we were allocating the dollars coming in.
Yeah, and I don't want to assume this, but hopefully if you're a church biz client, this is that you know this, but we were able to actually do this work of looking at expenses because we had tracked expenses, we had kept up with monthly reports, we had accurate financials.
Yeah.
All of those things were key in helping us identify the crisis. Hey, we're looking at, giving's decreased, expenses have gone up, and then also to have that detail to be able to look into it. So you want to have your books in order. If you don't have that, you don't really know what's going on.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
full plug for
Yeah.
bookkeeping and keeping that up, your monthly reporting.
Definitely.
We have an action step for each of these. We've kind of talked about some of this, but when facing a deficit, work with key staff and the leadership team of your church to trim spending for a season. Doesn't mean forever, but for a season. I'd encourage you to pray together for wisdom. That's something we did as well. I don't want to minimize that. We prayed, the Lord give us wisdom in all of this. And then again, just have that regular financial reporting and know what it means so that you can even realize, hey, we're in a crisis or we're heading for a crisis because of certain trends. So that's our action step for number 1. The second thing that we'd recommend to create a culture of giving in your church is regular communication. This sounds really basic, but we realized when we hit this crisis that when things were going well giving-wise, we tended to not say a ton about giving. It might be in our worship, might be mentioned, in a yearly members meeting, but we didn't speak about it as much. And we were convicted that, hey, we need to talk about giving not just when things are going bad or not going well, but when things are going good. We need to communicate the needs, communicate what's coming in regularly. It needs to be a regular thing for our church to hear us communicate about giving. And so we'd not completely been silent on it, but we just shared with our church, hey, we haven't done a great job of communicating about giving. We want to do better. And so we're going to start talking more about giving. We started doing a monthly update on here's our budget need, here's what came in this month, so that our congregation could be aware of that. That would go out in a monthly newsletter that our church staff would put out. And so we just realized, hey, we need to communicate and let people know what's going on with the budget. And people responded and appreciated that. So anything you would add to communication piece?
Yeah, the only thing I would say on that too is is there was some, there's a lot of caution and hurt, especially newer people coming to your church around, oh, the church is after my money. And that's why teaching on it and communicating on it is so important. And so there was very positive response from the church. There was some complaints. Some like, oh, now we're talking about money every month. And that's what my encouragement would be is, as Scripture says, don't take the mantle of church leadership lightly. One of the obligations you actually have, and we learned and stepped into more, was teaching stewardship is all of life, including our money. And we probably strayed too far away because of wanting to not hurt people, to not talking about it enough, and learn, no, we actually have a responsibility before God to teach on this, and we don't want to hurt anyone, but we just want to communicate clearly. And so as a leader, evaluate your motives, make sure you're teaching on it regularly. And like we started using the term God honoring at Church Biz. Is my motivation in this God honoring to actually lead and steward well for what our church needs? Because giving is an act of worship.
Yeah. So our action step we recommend here is develop a communication plan to share regular giving updates with your church, whether that's quarterly or monthly. I think we would encourage probably monthly touch points there. Communicate also the why of giving regularly. Don't just communicate the statistics, but the why. We're going to get to giving as worship in just a minute. That's our third point. But communicate.
Segued you in there.
Yeah, nice segue. Communicate the why behind it and remind people. And little, whether it's a little verse attached to your communication or just a little pastoral note from the pastoral team about why they give and what that means to the Lord. So even you talked about there's been a lot of bad teaching on giving and people have a lot of hurt behind it. Yeah. So that we reestablish people in a biblical view of giving, because as we'll see here in our next point, number 3, giving it's worship. It's a part of worship. And so our third point is really just to even convictionally work out amongst your leadership team that biblically giving is worship and it's closely connected to worship. We realized that in our gatherings, we had really kind of made giving a tack on, a non-regular thing that maybe would pop up once a year for a certain fund, or again, when a crisis hit. And so we really had to go back to our order of worship or our liturgy and say, how do we put giving in the service so that it is seen and forms us to see giving connected with worship. It's not just transactional. It's not just, hey, God wants money, we need to give him money, he's going to bless you when you give. It's, hey, no, this is a response of all that God has done for us in Jesus. I'm going to respond in offering back to him my money as really a symbol, like you said earlier, as a sign and a symbol of my whole life. But it's an act of worship. And we don't want to tell you where to put that in your gathering or how much or little to say about it. But what we would encourage you to do is to think through with your elders or whatever your leadership team is, what is our theology of giving? And we'd encourage you to root it in the Bible. And how in our worship services do we form people in giving? How is what we're regularly doing and teaching about giving forming people? Is it connecting to worship, or is it just feeling utility or transactional? So,
yeah, spot on. Yeah, don't have a ton to add there, but I do appreciate that add weekly. I think initially it was like right in with communion, right? Or we coming out of communion. Yeah, we talk about we're available for prayer. We also want to remind you giving is an act of worship. So it was very centralized in our gathering, in our context, and loved how we did that.
Yeah, and if you ever have questions with your leadership team, ask some like-minded churches what they're doing to cultivate giving as worship in the actual worship service of the church and get some ideas that way. So, but don't neglect to not just talk about it, but have it as a part of what you do regularly, whether that's monthly, every gathering. That's for you to decide, but we would encourage you to work that out. So that's pretty much the action step itself, but I'll read it. Consider how your church can make giving a regular part of worship. How can you make it regular and remind people of the why of giving? Once your leadership team answers these key questions, you can integrate it into the order of worship, the liturgy of your church. And again, let's bring up prayer. Pray that people would approach it and see it that way, that it wouldn't just be, oh, I got to get out my wallet, or hey, I've got to go online and do the transaction, but they would see it as this moment to offer worship to the Lord. So giving is worship. That's a huge, don't want to neglect the theology behind what we're talking about. And then the last two are really ways to kind of continue to build on that giving is worship. But number 4 is preaching on stewardship, or preaching on money. And so as we began to pray about how we should respond, we realized it's been 5 years since we've had a sermon series on giving. And so we should probably preach about it, right? If we want people to see it as worship, and we want it to be regularly communicated in a biblical way, we decided we needed to preach about it. So we put together, I think we did a month-long series on giving, and didn't just talk about money. We talked about giving as a whole. You want to say a little bit more about that? You have some notes on that?
Yeah, definitely. No, I was thankful for that series that we did. And like you mentioned, it was that stewardship is all of life. And so we talked about time, talent first, like how you serve, how you invest your time, and then treasure, to keep with the T's, alliteration, was the specific one related to how we spend our money and our earthly treasure. And I was grateful I got to preach that one, because I'm not a regular part of the preaching team. And so and I thought that came together pretty well, and just how we talked about that, addressed right up front, that God doesn't need your money, that God, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, Psalm 24. And then the main passage for that sermon was Matthew 6, that don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up treasures in heaven, which I'll come back to on our next point that we're going to talk about. But specific to that preaching series, we wanted to talk about that God doesn't need our money, and that the church was really, it's both a discipleship tool and the means by which God has chosen to advance his kingdom here on earth, because he knows that money can grip our hearts. And so we're actually taking our temporary treasure and investing that into eternal things. That's really beautiful. And that goes back to that act of worship. So we wanted to speak to the heart and root issue of why the Bible speaks so much about money, and how stewardship of money is a part of stewardship in all of life. And so we specifically looked at the role of the church, the body of believers, like what's our role in that, and then the role of church leadership. So it's actually a good teaching time within that to say, what are the elders of the church responsible for, and what are we responsible for as members within that, and then challenge everyone, what is your greatest treasure? What are you valuing the most? And how you spend your money shows that. And so as a couple practical takeaways, even thinking about that topic in particular, one of the things we touched on is both oversaving and overspending can be bad stewardship, because we always think of the overspending. You want to be a good steward, but there's sometimes God is asking us to be generous because we've been wise and we hold on too tightly. So it's really the difference between an owner and a steward, and we highlighted that a lot. We're not owners, we're stewards. We believe that the biblical worldview it's all God's, and I'm stewarding what he has given me. And so we looked at 1 Corinthians 16 on some practical teaching that Paul gave on how the church should give and be good stewards. You give regularly, intentionally, sacrificially, plentifully, and cheerfully, not out of guilt. And walk through that. And then we also walk through other passages, 1 Corinthians 9, Galatians 6, 1 Timothy 5, that talks about taking care of those who are ministering to the body, to the flock. And so, and even saying, like, God goes back to priority. So for us, we'd always had a priority of staff dollars. We want to have staff to lead the church. And so we were able to touch on all of those things in what I think was a really, really helpful way.
Yeah. I appreciate what you mentioned there, that we addressed everyone's role in stewardship, because sometimes when we preach on giving, it can, or maybe people have experienced this at past churches. I'm sure none of your churches that are watching, but when we talk about giving, the weight is all on the congregation. Like, you need to give sacrificially, you need to give more. Yeah. And really, and there's some truth. Each person should decide in their own heart how they should give with the Holy Spirit, and they should give. But also, you mentioned this, the staff, the elders, they're responsible for governing and leading
Yes.
the church and making sure that are we spending this well? Are we accounting for what we're spending? Do we have good policies and procedures in place to ensure that we're stewarding well? That's really a lot of what we're passionate about, is making sure the church side
Yeah.
is stewarding well. And so I think that's something important to remember. And it's not that you're turning around and preaching to yourself, but you're sharing with your church from a leadership perspective the things you've done as a team to make sure that you are stewarding well, that you've done your due diligence, that you've gone through a budgeting process, that you keep monthly reporting, that you have, third parties looking into your finances. All of those things that you might do, those are good reminders. Make sure you're doing those, and also to share with your congregation to let them know, hey, here's how we practice God honoring stewardship. So, any other things on number 4, preaching on it? The action step is basically just for those who are in authority to preach. You might be there, you might not, but you could suggest to your pastoral team, if you're in maybe you're on a finance team, hey, maybe we could set aside some sermon time to talk about giving. Or if you are a church planter or a pastor, you could maybe schedule, 2 to 4, 5 weeks where you talk about giving in the context of stewardship. So consider that. I think you could make a case that it probably needs to happen yearly, if not every other year, but we're just suggesting, we're not trying to tell you exactly what to do. Each church and group needs to decide that. So last number 5, similar to number 4, but a little bit nuanced, is teaching on stewardship. And so we went through our preaching series. It went well, had a great response to that. Taught, as Chris said, on the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. That's a great tool, pastors, by the way. Anytime you can do, what is it called? I always
Alliteration.
forget. Alliteration. Yes. Thank you, English professor. But we preached through it and realized, hey, it was great, but really just kind of scratched the surface and unearthed people wanting to talk more about stewardship. But in a sermon, you have 30, 45 minutes. You can't address every person's specific question. And so as we kind of huddled up after that, we thought, what if we followed this up with a class on stewardship, where we could kind of take the big ideas that we unpacked in the sermon, and then in the class we would address more granular topics and personal finance and some other things that people were asking about. And so we put together, what was our class? 4 weeks?
Yes.
I think so. We put together a 4-week class. It was 90 minutes. Where there was teaching, and then there was Q&A time where we talked on more granular issues of stewardship. So anything on that class that you wanted to bring out?
Yeah, no, you led into that well. I just taken some notes that may be even helpful, like practically, what did you guys teach on? Because I gave kind of the outline or some of the nuggets from the sermon specific to money in those classes. So the 4 weeks, 1 week was on time. 1 week was on talent, and then I led through the 2 on treasure. We actually broke that into 2 on the money side of it. And so over those 2 weeks, really started big picture treasure principle. What has God given you to a steward? And individuals or husbands and wives would actually take an inventory of what God had entrusted to them as stewards. Just get your personal financial snapshot, and then went through an exercise, values and priorities. So I gave an example from our household, like how we try to honor God with our money. We have these five principles that we try to abide by. These are the things we prioritize, where we're going to put our money first, and had everyone go through that exercise. What are your values and priorities with money? And it was cool. One couple actually went to I think Walgreens, and they got laminated their values and priorities and stuck them on the wall of their home. This is like, we want to keep this in front of us. And then got into budgeting, we got into debt, we got into savings, what you need to save for short term and save for on a long term basis. And so I think it was a really helpful time. It was funny. One younger person said, I think like paying off debt's kind of like an old school. I got some feedback on that, like his philosophy on like leveraging debt for personal finance. And so we got to have a good discussion about that. And actually in the notes I had, I had searched for every Bible verse that specifically addresses debt. Was able to kind of like walk through those things and why why there's wisdom in not having debt, because it's creating future obligations. And actually, as you free yourself with those future obligations, you're more freed up for ministry, more freed up to. And so we got into that topic, brought up a lot of good discussions, but there was even good discussions like, is a home good debt to have? And so I think it was a really helpful time, and we had great turnout, and so like you're saying, taking what you're hearing on Sunday morning and having a specific teaching space to pull it into the day to day is I think is a good general principle, and saw it work well in our local church context.
Yeah, that's really good. One thought, just even overall on all of this, is that when you do the work to get your finances in order, scrutinize your budget, respond responsibly, start talking about it, communicating, teaching on it, being transparent even about your views as a church, I think what it starts to do is it develops credibility and trust with your church. And when people trust leadership and they see that, hey, you've thought this out, you're doing this responsibly, you're paying attention to these things, it increases their trust. And when trust increases, people are more likely to want to support the ministry that you're doing. That sounds very basic, but when you don't talk about giving, when you don't teach on it, when it's kind of a taboo subject, or maybe you teach wrongly and you need to correct that. But if it's never mentioned, people don't tend to just trust. Trust has to be cultivated and built. And I think even through the classes, when you got to have a conversation like that, it just builds trust with people.
Absolutely.
And you can, and they see that, hey, there's some wisdom in our church, and the way that my gift or donation would be used is wisely.
Yes.
And yeah.
Absolutely. On a lighter note related to that, it made me chuckle because I'm 42 years old. And that's the first time, like, I remember a younger person kind of putting me in with the old people on money. I was like, okay, all right. I'm getting to that point in my life where, the younger people are disputing my views on money.
You don't realize it till everyone calls you sir. Like, oh, I thought I was just one of you, but no, you're 20 years younger than me.
And if I could I throw out a couple recommended resources on this, that what guided that preaching and teaching last fall for us? Two things that I would recommend for the church as a whole. The Treasure Principle by Randy Alcorn is a great book, and that actually, preaching on the Matthew 6 text about treasure is it was even more applicable because of the specific sermon passage we were in, but great resource on how to view money. Randy Alcorn has a lot of great stuff. God, Money, or God, Eternity, and Possessions, I think, is another book of his that I've read. So specific to the treasure principle, it really gets to the heart and the why that you're hearing come out, hopefully through this podcast. And I would just say that what was helpful in those times was a key principle from his book. It talks about the spiritual mutual fund. When you have a mutual fund, if you're familiar with that, which many are, you are giving your money to a manager on your behalf to go get a return on that investment. And so what Randy Alcorn in his book beautifully does is talks about the spiritual mutual fund, and that's that partnership between the body of believers, the church, and the leadership of the church, where you're actually, when you give to the church, you're entrusting those leaders with your resources, but you're not investing in an earthly return, you're investing in a spiritual return. And that's where the stewardship mentality instead of the ownership mentality, learning to think that way, though it fights our flesh nature, is like, when you give the church, you're actually entrusting to them your resources, that they're going to use it wisely for spiritual purposes, for eternal things. And that's even the caution to leaders listening to this. Shame on you if you ever use church or people giving for your own personal financial gain. You need to take care of yourself. You need to pay your bills. But man, they are entrusting you with their resources for the mission of the church. And so that's resource one, was Randy Alcorn, the treasure principle. Resource two is Budgeting for a Healthy Church by Jamie Dunlop. And that's a good resource for finance teams on the church leadership side, how to good guiding principles for the budgeting process to be good managers of what's entrusted to you.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I'll make sure to put a link to both those from Amazon on the podcast notes and wherever this is shared. So thank you so much, Chris. Hope that was helpful for you and your church. And we want to produce resources that help you and equip you and lead churches into God-honoring stewardship. So that's all we have for today. Have a great week. I didn't have anything thought through for fun time, so I thought we could do a section if you want to do a fun time section.
You don't have to. What do we like to do in the summertime? What's a fun summertime activity for our families?
We talk about ideal vacations.
Yeah.
You want to talk about ideal vacations?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, we're going to extend and have a little fun time. I was all business, and Chris reminded me, hey, it's summer. We need to have some fun in the podcast as well. So the topic for today is your ideal summer vacation. Okay, so have you had enough time? We just came up with this. Have you had enough time to think about that? Do you have an answer?
I love the mountains. I just relax in the mountains. My wife loves the beach, so we have to compromise.
You got to check it off, but it's
yeah. But so we compromised this year. Well, I learned, light bulb moment. What if I go to a place that has both mountains and ocean and beaches? California. Went to California the first time last year for vacation. Loved driving down Pacific One Highway. So actually going back with our girls this summer. We're going to go out to California and enjoy both of that.
Yeah.
What about you?
I'm 100% the mountains, but the rest of my family is 100% beach.
Yeah.
My son likes the mountains too, but so we checked off we did a little Texas beach trip, if that counts. And we're kind of, it's like a half, it's a little risky going to the Texas beach, but we're going to go to the mountains later this summer. I just enjoy sitting, looking, reading, eating good food, and maybe a good hike. That's all I need in the mountains, just to sit and enjoy, the beauty that God created.
You ever notice how God would ask people to go up the mountains to speak to him, and not to the beach? So maybe that supports our mountain.
I mean, there were seas.
That's true.
That happened, but still, there was not a lot of there wasn't just laying on the beach.
Yeah, it's a sea, not a beach, right? Jesus met Peter on a sea,
they were fishing,
not like a beach. Yeah.
So
mountains.
Beaches are mountains are 100% more godly than beaches. No, that's just kidding. You are closer to heaven. I mean,
true.
The skies.
True.
Yeah.
All right.
So
good stuff. Yeah.
We'll cut this before we get off the rails.
Yeah.
All right. You all have a good week.